I've said it before and I'll say it again. Russia is a paper tiger. For decades, they've threatened to invade and take over Alaska, but their military is so weak that the US has been able to easily stop them from doing it time and time again. In fact, Russia couldn't even take over Alaska if they wanted to because the US would literally rather nuke Russia than let them have it. But what if I told you there was a way Russia could have taken Alaska without having to fight the most powerful military on Earth? Well, it turns out there actually was, and it all has to do with one of the weirdest real estate deals in history. You see, for most of modern history, Alaska was a bit of an afterthought for the United States. Sure, it was nice to have, and we liked the idea of having all this empty land just in case something ever happened to the lower 48 states, but we didn't really have much use for Alaska itself, so we never spent any money developing the state or building up its infrastructure. We also had no real interest in exploiting any of Alaska's natural resources, which were actually quite extensive. Gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, coal, oil, natural gas, diamonds, and many other valuable resources were all present in large quantities in Alaska. But for most of American history, we weren't interested in extracting any of those resources. This led to a strange situation where Alaska wasn't really a part of the United States. Despite being one of our 50 states, we basically just left Alaska alone. This lack of oversight gave corrupt politicians and businessmen from the lower 48 states free rein to plunder Alaska's resources for cheap and ship them to the rest of the country to be sold off for a massive profit. These people made millions by simply stealing from the state government and exploiting the native peoples. And there was nothing the federal government did to stop them, which was pretty bad for the natives who'd already been through a lot at this point. When the US purchased Alaska from the Russians, there were around 15,000 to 25,000 indigenous Alaskans living there. But by the early 20th century, that number had dropped to around 60,000 due to exploitation and outright genocide. The US government didn't exactly treat these people like actual human beings. They were routinely denied basic rights and freedoms, not to mention forced onto small plots of land that were essentially worthless. The US didn't even recognize most of these reservations as sovereign land until 1971. And even then, these Alaskan natives were still treated as second-class citizens. So needless to say, these people weren't very happy with how things were going, and they saw Russia as their only hope for a better future. After all, Russia was the one who used to treat them fairly, and they probably wouldn't mind letting the natives return to their ancestral lands, right? Well, yes, that's probably what would have happened. You see, despite Russia's best efforts, they couldn't get back into Alaska because it was now an official part of the United States. But if they could find a way to get Alaska back before it became a state, then they might be able to restore their good relationship with the natives and gain some new allies in the process. And since Russia still controlled a small part of Alaska known as the Kuril Islands, they could always just annex the rest of the state while claiming it was simply reuniting Russian territory, and that's exactly what they tried to do. In 1916, Russia began making moves to take control of the entire state, hoping the US wouldn't put up much of a fight, and for a while it seemed like this plan might work. The US was still reeling from World War I, and we were hesitant to start another war. Plus, many Americans felt that Alaska was just a barren, frozen wasteland, so we wouldn't really care if Russia took it. This line of thinking was encouraged by none other than President Woodrow Wilson himself. He knew that if Russia took Alaska, it would make the US look weak and potentially cause other countries to try and take our other territories, so he decided to play along and pretend like he didn't care about Alaska. Wilson even went so far as to claim that he would end protest if Russia invaded the rest of the state. And just like that, Russia's plan was set in motion. They began taking control of key areas throughout Alaska, and they even landed troops on the major cities. But before they could make any further moves, the US declared war on them. Apparently, Wilson had been lying the whole time, and he never would have actually allowed Russia to take Alaska. Even though Russia hadn't officially declared war yet, the US had enough reason to go to war based on all the evidence pointing towards a full-scale invasion. So we attacked first, and we ended up winning a very quick and decisive victory. Russia surrendered shortly afterwards, and they were forced to sign away even more territory, including the Kuril Islands, which they'd hoped to use as an anchor to reclaim Alaska. But this wasn't the end of the story. Despite losing the war, Russia never officially recognized the outcome. They continued to lay claim to Alaska, and they began encouraging the native population to rebel against the US government. In response, the US took over the remaining Russian territories in the Pacific, and we even fought a brief war with Japan over it. But while the US was preoccupied with fighting overseas, Russia began planning their next move. Once again, they tried to encourage the natives to rebel against the US, but this time they offered them an even better deal. If the natives could successfully break away from the US and form their own independent nation, then Russia would immediately annex it and restore their lands. Now, I don't know what kind of deal the Russians were offering the Alaska natives behind the scenes, but whatever it was definitely a pretty sweet deal. Because while Russia was still technically at war with the United States, a group of native Alaskans broke away from the Union and attempted to declare independence. But this didn't last long, because once again, the US military stepped in and stopped them. Over the next few decades, Russia continued to push the Alaskan natives to rebel against the US, but they were always unsuccessful. This was mainly because the US was willing to put a lot of effort into defending their territories, especially Alaska, even though it was essentially useless to us. At this point, it seemed like Russia would never be able to take Alaska back. But then something interesting happened. In the late 1940s, the United States began investing heavily in the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, a massive network of roads and railways that would allow us to transport resources from the interior of the state to the coast. With this development, Alaska suddenly became very valuable to us, and we would do whatever it took to protect it. Even though the Cold War was heating up and we needed all the allies we could get, we had to tell the Russians that they could no longer meddle in Alaskan affairs. As you can imagine, they weren't too happy about this, but they backed off and stopped encouraging the natives to rebel. Now, Alaska is one of our most important states, and we would absolutely never sell it to Russia, even if they offered us money for it, which they actually did a few times. But during the Cold War, we weren't as hard up for cash as we are today, so we turned down their offers. But what if we were desperate for money and Russia offered us a deal we couldn't refuse? Would we really never consider selling Alaska to them? Well, as it turns out, we actually did consider it, but only for a few days. It was 1945, and the Second World War had just come to an end. The United States had come out of the war in terrible financial shape, and we desperately needed some extra cash, so we asked Russia if they'd be willing to buy Alaska from us for $100 million. At the time, this was a lot of money, but it was nothing compared to the amount of money both countries would spend during the Cold War. The Russians were initially reluctant to buy Alaska, but when they learned that the US was considering selling the Kuril Islands to Britain, they changed their mind. Russia accepted our offer, and we prepared to finalize the deal. But before either country could officially sign away Alaska, Britain backed out of the deal. Apparently, they didn't want to upset the Americans, so they refused to take the Kuril Islands. And just like that, the deal was off. Russia had lost their chance to take Alaska, and there would be no more opportunities like this for decades to come. Today, Russia continues to lay claim to Alaska, and they continue to meddle in local politics whenever they can. But now it's all just for show. Russia knows they'll never be able to take Alaska back, so they just keep doing it to save face. It's honestly kind of pathetic, and the only reason they haven't given up yet is because they can't accept the fact that they lost. But one thing's for certain, Russia will never take over Alaska unless they somehow develop the ability to teleport their troops there. Click here to watch one of these next videos. And remember, if you're not subscribed, you're never going to find out about them.